You wake up in a strange bed. The air feels heavy, thick with the smell of chemicals, and the dim light flickering from a single gas lamp makes the shadows in the corners stretch unnaturally. You reach for the door handle, but there is none. The wood is smooth where it should be metal. That's when your chest tightens, panic surges, and you realize the truth. You are trapped. It is Chicago, the year 1893, and the city is alive with wonder. The World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, has drawn millions of visitors from across the globe. Here, electric lights shine brighter than stars, new inventions dazzle, and hope for the future seems limitless. People marvel at moving sidewalks, grand Ferris wheels, and buildings lit up at night. The city is the showcase of progress, a monument to human achievement. But just a few miles away, in the quiet suburb of Englewood, there is a building that hides something darker, a structure so twisted in its design that it becomes a character itself, a predator disguised as a hotel. This is the place you've just awoken in, H. Holmes's Murder Castle. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett, does not look like a monster. In fact, he looks the opposite. Clean-shaven, neatly dressed with a charming smile that puts strangers at ease. To business associates, he is a doctor, a successful entrepreneur. To women, he is polite, attentive, even magnetic. He knows how to make people trust him. And it is that trust he exploits, time and time again. The Murder Castle, as newspapers would later call it, was Holmes's masterpiece. From the outside, it looked like any other three-story hotel. Brick walls, windows, shops on the ground floor. Nothing unusual, but inside was a labyrinth of madness. Some staircases went nowhere, ending at solid walls. Doors opened to sudden drops. Hallways twisted into dead ends. And worst of all, some rooms were designed for suffering. Hidden gas lines allowed Holmes to fill chambers with fumes at will. Others were lined with soundproof padding, where no scream could escape. Trapdoors led to chutes that dropped victims straight into the basement. And in that basement waited vats of acid, dissecting tables, and even a crematorium. It was a place where architecture itself became a weapon. The design was no accident. Holmes built it this way on purpose, hiring crews and firing them before they understood the full plan. No single builder ever knew the castle's complete layout. Holmes alone held the blueprint, and he used it as a hunting ground. Guests checked in, often women traveling alone to the World's Fair, dazzled by the charm of the young doctor who offered them cheap rooms. They never checked out. Imagine you are one of them. A visitor, excited by the marvels of Chicago, who thought a quiet room in Holmes's hotel was a stroke of good luck. And now you are awake, trapped, unsure if the hissing sound in the wall is just your imagination or the beginning of the end. The question is simple. Would you survive? Holmes's crimes are not easy to measure. He confessed to killing 27 people, but some estimates claim his victims numbered in the hundreds. How many checked into his hotel never to be seen again? How many vanished, their names lost to history, erased by acid or fire in that basement? No one will ever truly know. But what is certain is this: Holmes was more than a killer. He was a manipulator, a master liar, a man who built his life on deception as carefully as he built his hotel. Long before the castle, Holmes was practicing his art of deception. Born in New Hampshire in 1861, young Herman Mudgett showed intelligence and cunning from the start. As a boy, he dissected animals and showed an unusual fascination with death. As a student, he studied medicine and chemistry, learning how the human body worked, knowledge he would later use in horrifying ways. He also learned how to forge documents, fake insurance policies, and swindle money. Wherever he went, lies followed. When he arrived in Chicago in the late 1880s, he reinvented himself as Henry Howard Holmes. The new name was cleaner, more elegant, and easier to trust. He found work as a pharmacist, opened businesses, courted women. and soon he had enough wealth to buy a plot of land across from his pharmacy. On it, he built his strange hotel, brick by brick, trap by trap. It is one thing to read about such a place, but imagine walking through it. A hallway that looks normal until you realize the door you just opened leads only to a brick wall. A staircase that goes up 2 floors and ends in nothing. A bedroom with a door that locks only from the outside. You hear footsteps behind you, but when you turn, the hall is empty. The castle was a maze, and in its corridors, fear itself became a weapon. Holmes thrived on fear. He seduced women, lured them with promises of marriage or jobs, then made them disappear. He scammed creditors by taking out loans under false names, then vanishing. He charmed investors into backing his hotel without telling them its true purpose. Every part of his life was deception. And yet, he was so charming, so persuasive, that most people never suspected. Chicago in 1893 was the perfect hunting ground. Millions of visitors poured into the city for the World's Fair. Strangers were everywhere. People came and went daily, and if someone vanished, who would notice? A missing girl, a vanished tourist. Easy to dismiss in the chaos of a city overflowing with travelers. Holmes knew this, and he used it. His castle became a spider's web, invisible until it was too late. Now imagine again. You are locked in one of his rooms. The air is growing harder to breathe. Do you shout for help, knowing the walls are padded? Do you look for a hidden door, knowing it might lead only to another trap? Do you wait, silent, hoping Holmes has chosen someone else tonight? The clock ticks, and every sound feels like a death sentence. Would you survive? What makes Holmes even more terrifying is how normal he appeared. He wasn't a brute with wild eyes. He was calm, polite, even gentle. He dined with his victims, made them feel safe, and then, when their guard was down, he struck. He didn't just kill, he controlled, manipulated, and erased. His murders were not crimes of passion, but acts of engineering. Some say the Murder Castle was America's first true house of horror, a real-life nightmare. And perhaps what makes it most chilling is that it existed not in the shadows, but right out in the open, in a thriving city during a time of progress and celebration. But how did Holmes hide such evil for so long? How did no one notice what was happening inside his walls? The truth is, some did suspect. Neighbors noticed strange deliveries, large amounts of quicklime, acid, and other chemicals. Some workers thought the building's layout was odd, but Holmes always had excuses. He claimed he was designing for security, or building secret storage for valuables. And because he was charming, because he always had a story, most believed him. For now, in this nightmare you've woken into, the question is whether there is a way out. Perhaps you find a loose floorboard, a hidden passage Holmes didn't intend to be discovered. Perhaps you catch him at the wrong time, when his attention is elsewhere, and slip out into the night. A few did survive encounters with Holmes, mostly by sheer luck or timing, but the odds were never good. You hear footsteps again, closer this time. A faint creak along the hallway floorboards outside your locked room. Someone pauses just beyond the wall. You hold your breath, listening. Then silence. Did they leave? Or are they waiting? Your pulse races as you realize that in this place, silence is worse than noise. Holmes was not always called a killer. To the world outside, he was a man of success. His pharmacy across the street was respectable, his smile reassuring. He dressed in fine suits, spoke gently, and offered employment to young women who came to the city searching for opportunity. He promised marriage to some, jobs to others, and his words were so convincing that they rarely questioned him. He had a way of knowing what people wanted to hear, and he gave it to them. Behind that mask of civility, he was constructing the stage for his cruelest tricks. The castle was not just a hotel, it was an experiment in control, a machine for terror. Some rooms had peepholes built into the walls so Holmes could watch his victims in secret. Some were lined with iron plates to make them airtight. In these, hidden gas lines snaked into the walls. Holmes could turn a valve and fill the chamber with invisible death while standing safely outside. Down below, the basement was his final workshop. Chutes from the upper floors slid down into darkness where bodies were stripped, dissected, and destroyed. Acid vats dissolved flesh. Quicklime stripped bones clean. Furnaces reduced remains to ash. Holmes's medical training allowed him to remove organs and tissues, which he sometimes sold to medical schools under false pretenses. Victims were erased, transformed into profit, leaving little trace behind. The chilling part is how ordinary the castle looked to those who passed it on the street. It stood across from shops and houses, a brick building blending into its neighborhood. Nothing about its exterior screamed danger. To the average visitor, it was just another hotel in a booming city. The horror was all on the inside, and inside, the World's Fair brought him opportunity after opportunity. The Columbian Exposition was a magnet for travelers. Single women, families, businessmen, and workers looking for lodging. People disappeared in Chicago all the time during the fair. Crowds were massive, the city overflowing, crime common. So when someone vanished, few asked questions. Holmes counted on that. But for all his careful planning, not everything about Holmes was flawless. He was a compulsive liar and a greedy man, and sometimes his schemes caught up with him. He took out insurance policies on fake employees only to have them die mysteriously and collect the payout. He convinced women to sign over property or life insurance, charming them into contracts that sealed their fate. He left behind unpaid debts, furious creditors, and unfinished promises. Each lie pulled him deeper into webs he could barely control. Imagine, in your own situation, you found a way to open the door. Perhaps the lock is faulty, or perhaps it never fully clicked shut. You slip into the hallway, heart pounding, and the silence feels unbearable. The corridor stretches ahead, dimly lit by gas lamps. At the far end, you see two doors, one slightly ajar. Do you enter, or do you keep moving? In Holmes's castle, neither choice guarantees survival. Behind one door might be a hidden chamber with no exit. Behind another, a trap that leads straight down into the basement. The very design of the building worked against you. Holmes thrived on confusion. Guests wandered the castle's twisting hallways, often disoriented, unsure of where they were. He designed it this way deliberately, making escape almost impossible. Rooms had multiple doors, but some opened to brick walls, others to shafts that dropped into darkness. The second floor was the most treacherous, a maze within a maze where only Holmes knew the true path. He was the master of his environment, and anyone inside was his prey. What is striking about Holmes is that he was not motivated only by money or lust for killing. He seemed to enjoy the very act of manipulation. He watched his victims with detachment, testing how far he could push before fear overtook them. He rarely dirtied his own hands with direct violence. Instead, he let the building do the work. A valve turned, a trapdoor opened, a gas line ignited. These were his weapons. It was murder disguised as design. And yet, for all his cunning, Holmes eventually overreached. His greed drove him into increasingly reckless schemes. When the World's Fair ended, the flood of easy victims dried up. He turned to insurance fraud more aggressively, staging deaths and tricking companies. He involved accomplices, promising them money and shares, only to betray them as well. Eventually, his lies piled too high, and suspicion followed him. But in 1893, when the fair was at its peak, he was at his most dangerous. Reports say women who came to Chicago for work or adventure often checked into his hotel and were never seen again. Their families assumed they had run away, disappeared into the chaos of the fair. Few ever suspected they had walked willingly into Holmes's carefully crafted web. Picture yourself, wandering the castle's upper floors. The wallpaper changes, patterns shifting, hallways doubling back on themselves. You hear the sound of faint machinery below, maybe the rumble of the furnace, maybe something worse. Behind you, a door slams. Ahead of you, a stairway leads upward, but halfway up, it ends at a solid wall. You descend, only to find the corridor you came from is gone. The castle disorients, twists, reshapes itself in your mind until you no longer know where the exit is. That was Holmes's greatest trick, making the familiar feel alien, turning safety into a trap. What makes his story chilling is how close he came to getting away with it forever. Holmes was intelligent, calculating, and above all, adaptable. When people asked questions, he had answers. When creditors demanded payment, he made excuses. When authorities grew suspicious, he smiled and charmed them. He was the kind of man who could shake your hand while planning your downfall. And so you stand in the corridor, pulse racing, wondering which door leads to freedom and which leads to the basement. Would you survive? Most didn't. Some never even realized they were in danger until it was too late. The deeper truth about Holmes is that he embodied the darker side of the American dream. Chicago in the 1890s was a city of opportunity, a place where anyone could reinvent themselves. Holmes did exactly that. He turned himself from Herman Mudgett into Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. But instead of building, he destroyed. Instead of healing, he killed. His castle was not a place of comfort, but a monument to deceit and cruelty. And yet, in those years, very few knew. To his neighbors, he was a respectable businessman. To investors, a clever entrepreneur. To women, a charming suitor. And to the police, just another face in the crowd. The horror of the murder castle was invisible to most until it was too late. But history has a way of catching monsters, even the most careful ones. Holmes's lies eventually tangled around him, and his downfall began with greed, just as his empire of deception had. The castle would not last forever. But on the night you imagine yourself inside it, surrounded by walls designed to confuse and destroy, you don't know any of that. You only know that escape seems impossible. The air is colder now. You creep down the corridor, pressing your hand to the wall for balance. It feels wrong, too thin, almost hollow, and then you realize why. Holmes has built another hidden chamber behind it. You can't see who's inside, but you hear faint scratching, a muffled cry, and then silence. The castle feels alive, as though it is breathing with you, waiting for you to make the wrong step. Holmes had built a machine that seemed unstoppable, but even the most clever predator eventually stumbles. After the World's Fair ended, the steady stream of travelers slowed. Holmes turned to bigger schemes: insurance fraud, scams, and staged deaths. He roped in accomplices, promising them riches if they played along. But Holmes never shared fairly. He betrayed allies as easily as he betrayed his victims. And soon those closest to him began to question his motives. One of his boldest schemes involved a business partner named Benjamin Petezel. Holmes convinced Petezel to fake his own death so that his wife could collect the insurance money. The plan was simple: stage the death, collect the payout, split the profits. But Holmes had no intention of splitting anything. Instead, he murdered Petezel for real. Worse, he manipulated Petezel's widow and took custody of 3 of her children under the guise of helping them travel. Those children vanished. Their fate, when discovered, horrified the nation. This was the turning point. Authorities, who had tolerated Holmes's endless lies and scams, finally began piecing together the enormity of his crimes. Detectives tracked his movements, uncovered inconsistencies, and started connecting disappearances to his name. He had always been one step ahead, but now the walls were closing in. Imagine, for a moment, that you managed to find the staircase leading down. The steps are slick, damp with the smell of chemicals rising from below. You descend slowly, each creak echoing like thunder in the silence. At the bottom, the stench hits you. Acid, charred wood, decay. The basement of the murder castle was no ordinary cellar. This was Holmes's laboratory of death. Here, he reduced bodies to bone and bone to ash. Vats of acid sat beside dissecting tables. Furnaces glowed faintly. their heat lingering even in silence. This was where his victims disappeared forever. If you had made it this far, your chances of survival were nearly zero. Holmes controlled the exits, the locks, the valves. The basement was not a place to escape, but a place where escape ended. Very few who went down those chutes or staircases ever returned. Holmes's arrest in 1894 brought the horrors into the light. Newspapers dubbed him the Beast of Chicago, America's first serial killer, and most famously the man who built a murder castle. The public, already fascinated with true crime, devoured every detail. Reporters described the castle's design, its traps, its hidden rooms, with morbid fascination. Some stories exaggerated the truth, but the core was undeniable. Holmes had built a structure that embodied cruelty itself. At his trial, Holmes sat calmly, even confidently. He charmed the courtroom, smiled for journalists, and described himself as a man born with the devil inside him. His words were chilling, not only for their arrogance, but for their honesty. He admitted to some murders, denied others, and hinted at many more. Estimates of his victims ranged from dozens to hundreds, though he himself confessed to 27. The true number will never be known. And then came his end. In 1896, Holmes was hanged in Philadelphia. Even in death, he drew attention. He requested to be buried in a coffin filled with cement, afraid that his body would be stolen or dissected. The request was granted, and his grave was sealed. It was almost fitting that a man who erased so many left so little of himself behind. But the legend of the murder castle did not die with him. The building itself stood for a few more years. In 1895, parts of it mysteriously burned in a fire. Some said arson, perhaps an attempt to erase its secrets. Eventually, it was demolished. Today, the site is occupied by a U.S. post office. Ordinary people walk its floors every day, unaware of what once stood there. Beneath the pavement, beneath the bricks, the memory lingers. So if you woke up in Holmes's murder castle, would you survive? The answer is grim. Few did. Most were lured by charm, trapped by design, and destroyed by a man who saw human lives as nothing more than opportunities. Survival required luck, quick wit, or sheer coincidence. And even then, escape was never guaranteed. The castle was not a hotel. It was a hunting ground, and the prey rarely won. Yet Holmes's story is not only about terror. It is also about the limits of deception. For years, he thrived on lies, wearing a mask of civility while hiding the monster beneath. But in the end, lies collapsed under their own weight. Holmes was not caught because he left a trail of bodies. He was caught because his greed in scamming insurance companies drew suspicion. His own schemes betrayed him, just as he betrayed everyone else. And perhaps that is the lesson of the murder castle. Evil often hides behind charm, wearing a smile, speaking kindly, promising safety. But behind the mask, something darker may lurk. Holmes's hotel was a reflection of himself. Polished brick on the outside, labyrinth and horror on the inside. He embodied the danger of appearances, the predator disguised as a gentleman. Now the question remains, not just for you, but for history. How many never escaped? How many names are gone forever, dissolved in acid, burned to ash, erased from memory? The victims of H.H. Holmes remain largely anonymous, shadows lost to time. And yet the story endures, retold again and again as a warning, a fascination, and a reminder that progress and horror often walk hand in hand. So imagine again that you wake up in that locked room, the door smooth and handleless, the hiss of gas creeping through the walls. Would you find the hidden latch in time? Would you smash through plaster and stumble into the hallway? Would you risk the basement or climb higher in search of a window? The murder castle was built so that every choice led closer to death. And in Holmes's eyes, that was the genius of it. History answered the question long ago. most would not survive. Few ever did, and those who entered his castle were swallowed by its walls, their stories ending in darkness. Only the legend remains, a tale that still chills, a nightmare that history never forgets. So, if you enjoyed this journey through one of history's darkest places, subscribe now, because next time we'll take you somewhere equally haunting, where history, crime, and mystery intertwine. And once again, we'll ask the question, if you woke up there, would you survive?